Hey everyone, I wanted to go over some new and amazing news that we have for the Shin Megami Tensei Gaiden fandom, or if you're just simply a fan of Shin Megami Tensei. And that is the fact that 3 games lost to time are gonna be making their way not just to the Nintendo Switch, but also on the PC as well. And that is thanks to Gmod. They have been working on their Archives Plus series for quite a while. They have been porting over games from long lost consoles that simply just almost no one has access to, and recently they have taken up the mantle and porting over games from mobile devices. And now we are going to be able to get our hands on essentially the entire trilogy of the Shin Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible New Testament series, the first, second, and third entry. These were all mobile games released back in 2008, 2009, and 2010. Simply put, no one has access to these games on mobile devices, of course. Mobile devices simply just don't have access to retroactive games that were stuck maybe on one specific phone model or maybe one specific company or something along those lines, specifically when they were stuck in another country like in Japan. So now they are going to be making their way to modern consoles on the Nintendo Switch and on the PC via Steam. I want to give a huge shout out to Gamatsu for putting up a relatively good article explaining the entire nuance of this, and essentially where we got the details that these games are not necessarily confirmed as of the release date just yet. We do know that they're going to be in 2023 at some point. We do also have the confirmation that they will be releasing in Japan first, because of course these games were only ever released in Japan for a Japanese audience. There is no current English translation, maybe through mods or something like that, but officially through Atlas, there was never any actual English version of these games. What we do know is that Gmod Archives Plus has been working trying to get localization efforts for some of the games that they're porting, not all of them. So there is a chance that we could end up seeing these games getting localized for an English audience. What we do know for sure now, and I'm going to be leaving a link in the description below, A, for the link of the Gamatsu article, which provides all the details that you should be seeing on the screen, but also B, a link to the description below that you should be able to find for the Steam Japanese page. There you should be able to find all 3 games, the official Japanese titles: Gmod Archives, Megami Tensei Gaiden, Shinjuku Last Bible, Gmod Archives Plus, Megami Tensei Gaiden, Shinjuku Last Bible 2, and lastly, Gmod Archives Plus, Megami Tensei Gaiden, Shinjuku Last Bible 3, Mugen no EU. So these are the 3 games. Each one of them also has their very own separate trailers. You should be seeing that running in the background as well. So essentially all these games are going to be making their way onto the Nintendo Switch and on Steam of next year. Now, if you're wondering how is it that basically these games were lost to time, or if you don't necessarily know much about the Shin Megami Tensei Gaiden series, essentially this was the, let's call it the light version. This was before Persona, the light version of Shin Megami Tensei, when this franchise was originally introduced by already Atlas, which had already made Shin Megami Tensei games already. They were trying to cater to something of a younger audience, children, something, young adults, so they couldn't necessarily make them as dark and brooding as the Shin Megami Tensei series is. So they made it a specific decision to be able to kind of tone down, the details in the story, maybe even the monster creatures or anything like that, even the game mechanics to a certain degree, to be able to cater to a brand new audience. And this franchise saw ultimately 8 separate releases. The first one was Megami Tensei Gaiden Revelations: The Demon Slayer. This one was released on the Game Boy on 1992. That's how long ago this franchise goes back. The second was Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible 2, essentially a sequel to Revelations: The Demon Slayer. This one was released also on the Game Boy. Last Bible 3 was released on the Super Famicom back in March 4th of 1995. Soon after that, also in 1995, which was almost the peak of this specific franchise, another Bible was released. This one was a Game Boy game. And lastly, Last Bible Special was also released. It was something of a double release, if you will, both for the Game Boy games released on the Sega Game Gear at the time, back in 1995. So ultimately, they ended up seeing releases in 1992, 1993, 1995, and pretty much 3 games released in 1995 back to back. So until 2008, you never saw another release on this franchise, when the Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible New Testament release was dropped for mobile devices. This was back in January 16th of 2008, and this is the first game that we are talking about being ported to the Nintendo Switch and on PC via Steam. Soon after that, on April 23rd in 2009, we ended up seeing New Testament number 2, and after that in 2010, the last release for this franchise, on September 17th, 2010, we ended up seeing New Testament 3. So that is pretty much the legacy of this franchise, and those Last Bible New Testament entries 1, 2, and 3 are the ones that are going to be making their way onto the Nintendo Switch and on Steam at some point next year, thanks to the Gmod Archives Plus series, which once again, they are doing God's work. I remember specifically covering at some point, I want to say around April of last year, that they had announced that they were going to be bringing over something along the lines of like 26 or 34 or some ridiculous number of like long lost games from like mobile devices and Game Gear and Sega Genesis and Atari and stuff like that. They have been on even mobile devices. They have been working on games for quite a while, bringing them over from old, basically completely outdated, unless you actually have one of those consoles, simply just don't have access to those games, bringing them over, of course, not just to the Nintendo Switch, but on the PC as well. It is worth noting, however, that a lot of people have made this point very clear. Nintendo does have a track record of eventually shutting down their stores, digital stores, something that we actually have seen, of course, already with like the 3DS store shutting down, I believe, next year. And, people not necessarily being able to purchase titles from the Game Boy Advance era, the Game Boy era, the DS, the DSi, now the 3DS and the 2DS, all those games eventually are going to go away. You're not going to be able to purchase them anymore. So a lot of people are hesitant to buy games on the Nintendo Switch eShop, with the understanding that some of these games that are even being ported now might stay alive for another, 10 years or so on the eShop, but eventually Nintendo will do what Nintendo does and they will go away. However, on Steam, that is currently not the case. We have not necessarily seen that Steam is going to be making games go away for whatever reason. Therefore, unless Nintendo, clearly does the right thing here and confirms that the next generation console is going to be supporting backwards compatibility with the Nintendo Switch, whether they call it a Switch 2, whether they make a Switch 2, whatever the next console is, does have backwards compatibility with the Nintendo Switch and more specifically with the eShop. Therefore, the eShop should be able to stay alive and those games will be supported on their future consoles. Hopefully, they do the same thing that Microsoft has been doing, where they are supporting still games from like, early 2000s, so maybe that is something that Nintendo will hopefully explore going into the future. But for now, a lot of people are still suggesting maybe Steam is still the best way to go for now, since you do ultimately own the files there and they are not specifically locked into one specific console. And if you lose access to that console and you cannot transfer your save data, then it becomes a little bit of a problem. So that is something worth considering. So with all that said, huge shout out once again to Gamatsu for putting up this article, link in the description below. Gmod for putting this amazing archive series, finally bringing it back out of the dead, and hopefully, of course, it gets localized if they have the budget for it. And of course, if you're brand new to my channel, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.